Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Emerald Ash Borer University, a webinar series funded by the USDA Forest Service. My name is Robin Usborne, and I'm from Michigan State University, and along with my EAB University colleagues, Amy Stone from The Ohio State University, and Sarah Stack and Dr. Cliff Sadoff from Purdue University, we welcome you to today's presentation by Minnesota Department of Agriculture entomologist, Mark Abrahamson. Mark's presentation today is entitled Manage EAB or Manage the Forest, where he will be sharing some interesting work about area-wide approaches to the management of EAB in urban and forested areas in Minnesota. His perspectives are likely to be informative to many of you who are involved with EAB programs. Mark has been at the Department of Agriculture since 1999 and supervises a work unit that conducts early detection surveys and works to control new invasive species. Emerald ash borer has been a major area of work for Mark over the past 10 years, and among other things, he has inspected thousands of ash trees and peeled miles of logs. Mark is originally from Wisconsin and received a bachelor's in biology from University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and a master's in entomology at the State University of New York in Syracuse. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that your comments and questions are welcome today. Please feel free to write them in the question and answer feature, which you can find by mousing over the bottom or occasionally the top of your screen. We will be making a note of these questions, and Mark will be responding to them after the presentation so we can keep this webinar flowing smoothly. To keep these free webinars coming, we really need your feedback. Tomorrow, you're going to receive an email from me with a link to a short, voluntary, confidential survey that I hope you will take time to fill out. If you're one of the first 10 people to fill out the survey, we will be sending you an EAB goodie bag. But we hope you'll give us feedback either way. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing soon at www.emerald-borer.info. You will also find the recordings for all previous EAB University webinars on that website. Thank you for attending today, and Mark, you can now share your screen with your presentation and we'll get started.
Okay, thanks, Robin. So did I remember to unmute my microphone?
You did just fine. Okay,
perfect. Well, thanks again. Thanks everybody for attending. I'm happy to be here and talk about this topic too. Like Robin said, this emerald ash borer has been a big part of our work for some time, and I think hopefully we have an interesting perspective to share. I want to right away talk about our funders and our partners on this project. Work on emerald ash borer in Minnesota has been funded through USDA, both PPQ and the Forest Service. And we've also been fortunate to been able to get some state funds through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And then there have been many partners who've worked on this project. Some of the more prominent ones I'm showing here, but there are many other folks as well that I'm not able to include at this time. So a very collaborative project. So as the title indicates, really I want to talk about managing emerald ash borer, managing really urban forests in Minnesota. And I think a good place to start is with this cartoon. And this is, I call it a cartoon because it's loosely based on data, but it's really just meant to represent an understanding of how emerald ash borer populations change over time and how tree mortality can follow along with them. And so when we're talking about managing something, the way that I look at this is that if we're managing the forest, really what we're thinking about is this blue line, which represents tree mortality from emerald ash borer. And we may not be thinking so much about the red line. Whereas if we're thinking about managing from the perspective of managing the emerald ash borer, we might be focused more on that red line and then expect that the blue line might change as well if we alter the trajectory of that red line. And so it's kind of a matter of semantics, but I think it ends up being important. And when we think about the tools that we use and how we use them, I think that's where it becomes important. So when I think about emerald ash borer management, managing the beetle itself, I'm imagining things that will reduce the population size of emerald ash borer as it is right now. So things that kill emerald ash borers. And so the tools that we have to do that include removing infested trees and destroying them, so sanitation, using insecticides in areas where we know emerald ash borer is present. That might be infested trees or trees very near infested trees. But the point would be that we're using insecticides in a way that we're expecting they are having an impact on the emerald ash borer population. And then finally, the biological control agents, the parasitic wasps, which attack and kill various life stages of emerald ash borer. Now, when we think about forest management, it's really basically the same things, just implemented in a different way. So the way I would define managing the forest is when we're doing things that might be beneficial for our forest, but aren't having any impact on the emerald ash borer population at this point in time. So it's the same tools. It could be removing trees, perhaps replacing them. But if we're removing trees that aren't necessarily infested with emerald ash borer, perhaps we're preemptively removing them to get ahead of the game and get some different trees other than ash in the forest. It's not really going to have any impact on emerald ash borer as it is in this day and time. The same goes for insecticide applications that may not be in areas where we know emerald ash borer is present. So in that case, what I think we're doing is more managing the risk from emerald ash borer. And again, it's more of a forest management tactic to protect trees we want to preserve. But if we don't know that those insecticides are having an impact on the emerald ash borer population, then I would consider that to be more of a forest management tool rather than an emerald ash borer management tool. And I think from my experience here in Minnesota, many cities that we're working with are using some element of both of these approaches, and everybody really is coming at it from a forest management approach. Some are coming at it also from an emerald ash borer management approach a little bit more heavily than maybe others are. And I don't mean to say that one is right or one is wrong. They're just kind of different approaches. And I do think it's important to make that distinction to understand, what actions we're taking are meant to do. And I know I've seen many times in newspaper stories here in Minnesota where cities' actions are being reported that they're preemptively removing ash trees to slow the spread of the emerald ash borer. Well, that's not really true. They're preemptively removing ash trees because they're trying to diversify their forest in advance of emerald ash borer affecting those trees. So I do think it's an important distinction. And really the key difference is that if we're talking about managing the forest, and here I've got a map of the Twin Cities metro area, and Minneapolis to the west and St. Paul to the east are highlighted. But if we're talking about managing the forest, we may not need to really have a very clear idea of where in that forest emerald ash borer is, because we may be using other criteria by which to select trees to remove or select trees to treat with insecticides. However, if we're going to try to manage the beetle itself, then it's absolutely imperative that we have a very clear idea of where the beetle is within a forest, and that can be difficult. So I just wanted to lay kind of the basics of what I'm talking about out here at the beginning. And I think now we'll move into a little bit of kind of our initial experience with emerald ash borer in Minnesota and how that shaped kind of the general approach that we would recommend to cities in terms of how to deal with it and how to think about managing the beetle. And after that, then we'll move into a little bit, we got some data we can share on some of our experiences in trying to identify where emerald ash borer is present within cities. So emerald ash borer was first found in St. Paul in May 2009. It was a little bit ironic because it had recently been found just across the border in Victory, Wisconsin, which is just east of the very southeastern corner of Minnesota. And so we were very concerned about that. And of course, it's about a 3-hour drive from St. Paul down to that part of the state. And then you have to get on a boat and go out into the Mississippi River Channel and go out on the islands. And we were looking for emerald ash borer out there. In the meantime, it was discovered in St. Paul about 15 minutes from our office. So that was our first official find, was right in the middle of the St. Paul, Minneapolis metropolitan area. And at this time, it was kind of we were kind of in between, I feel like, approaches to emerald ash borer. So eradication had pretty much fallen by the wayside at that point. We knew emerald ash borer is not going to be eradicated from St. Paul. A few people still mentioned that, but it was never really taken seriously. So we knew that wasn't an option. And there was enough known that we knew what was going to happen if nothing happened, if it was just allowed to run its course. So We don't want to have go that road either. So that kind of left us in the middle. We knew we wanted to do something, but we weren't entirely sure what that should be. At the same time, this was when Deb McCullough and her group in Michigan State were doing a lot of work with SLAM, and both Deb and Nate had published some important work on estimating how many beetles will come out of trees, and it was very clear that some trees produce a lot more beetles than other trees. And so these are some of the things that were going on at the national level that influenced some of our thoughts about how we might approach things in Minnesota, and particularly in the Twin Cities. And also, we kind of had the backdrop of Dutch elm disease, and the Twin Cities, area, cities in Minnesota, have a pretty long history of dealing with Dutch elm disease. It was during the 70s that it really swept through the state, but we still have a lot of elm trees left today in cities, and many cities very actively manage Dutch elm disease. So they're very familiar with this concept of identifying infected trees in this case, and then removing them and destroying them in order to keep levels of inoculum low and keep the disease at a low level. And so we had the idea that we wanted to do something similar with emerald ash borer. We knew we weren't going to get rid of it, but we wanted to try and take some actions to keep the population as at low of a level as we could. So what was important then is to be able to find those infested trees, and people are very familiar with how to do that Dutch elm disease, but less so with emerald ash borer. And so we had kind of a trial by fire, I guess you could say, with this first infestation. And despite making trips to Michigan and Ohio and other places to see infested trees, it still was a learning experience to have to go out and find those trees. And it wasn't made any easier by the fact that what we were finding eventually is that our infested trees, a lot of them looked like this. So they were, the ash trees that didn't really look any different from any other ash tree in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area. And when we were looking at them, they didn't have the red rings painted on them yet, so they're harder to pick out as infested. And then to complicate that, we had trees in that same neighborhood, in the same blocks as those trees I just showed you on the slide before, that looked terrible. And we figured, well, these are going to have emerald ash borer for sure. But when they were removed, we were sampling trees because we were interested to see what the density of the population was in these trees and whatnot. And we couldn't find any emerald ash borer in these trees. So it quickly became apparent to us that kind of the general condition of a tree is not a great indicator as to whether emerald ash borer is present in it or not. And we started queuing in pretty quickly on a little bit more subtle symptoms that many people are familiar with. What a great indicator woodpecker feeding can be for finding emerald ash borer. So really that became one of the primary things that we were looking at with these trees. And another was bark cracking. And this is a pretty distinctive looking bark crack. You can see the tunnel in there. You can even see an exit hole to the right of it. But these were some of the what we called suspicious symptoms. And that became important because we had to emphasize to people that just because you have a tree with woodpecking on it or there's a split in the bark, it doesn't mean it's infested with emerald ash borer. These are just symptoms that make us suspicious. And what we then considered to be diagnostic symptoms were primarily if we could get a look at a tunnel underneath the bark of the tree and see the distinctive S-shaped tunnel. It's a very distinctive looking gallery. Once you have a good eye for it, you can easily distinguish it from all the other things you might find in an ash tree. And then also the larval life stages. And for our intents and purposes, we're not really finding adult beetles generally on these trees. We're not worrying about that. I generally caution people away from looking for exit holes. Personally, I think they tend to be hard to find and sometimes can be a little bit amorphous in their shape. Can be confused with other things. So I really prefer just to dive right down under the bark of the tree and look for tunneling and or life stages. And again, this was important in terms of explaining to people how they might look for these trees, but then also practically speaking in St. Paul, where these first trees were being dealt with, it was at a time, I guess you'd say, that cities in Minnesota weren't really comfortable yet in terms of how they might apply insecticides against emerald ash borer. So really the only management that was happening at that time was tree removal. So if an infested tree was found, it would be removed and destroyed. And the difference was that if the city found a tree on public property, and it had just what we were calling those suspicious symptoms, that was enough. They would mark it, remove it, destroy it. But if there was a tree on private property, then they wanted a higher burden of proof, and so we needed to have these diagnostic symptoms. They needed to be able to see emerald ash borer tunneling or have a life stage from it, so they could document to the property owner that this tree had to be removed and destroyed. And that kind of brings us into what evolved into kind of our general recommendation for how cities deal with emerald ash borer. It is a recommendation. Each entity is free to make up their own mind in terms of what they're going to do with emerald ash borer. From the state level, really, we just are responsible for regulating the quarantine boundaries. So all the work we do with cities is more of an advisory role and trying to help them formulate a plan to manage it. But really, the cornerstone for cities and our recommendation for cities in Minnesota is to make sure you are actively dealing with any emerald ash borer infested trees that you can find. And this would, again, be a component of managing the emerald ash borer that then hopefully helps in terms of managing your forest. So what does that mean dealing with them? Really, there's only a few options. You can remove them, you can treat them with insecticides, or you can let them die and fall apart. And so for a city environment, most trees can't be allowed to die and fall apart. They will become hazards. So it really leaves us with two options. Either they're removed or they're treated with insecticides. Obviously, a tree like the one in the picture is beyond treatment with insecticides. That would be removed. But if it's a tree that's still healthy, that has become an option for residents, whether the tree's on their private property or if they want to adopt a tree on the street. Cities have generally given them that option to either have the tree removed and destroyed or have it treated with insecticide. And really, that's it's been kind of something we've had to keep harping on for cities, that we really strongly feel they should be dealing with these private property trees. Sometimes cities feel like they might want to just worry about the public property trees because that's a big enough problem. But if you're going to be trying to manage the emerald ash borer, you can't afford to ignore these trees on private property, because they might make up half or more of the ash trees in the forest, and you're not going to be very successful just looking at half the trees. What evolved as, and I'll pick out St. Paul as an example here, and kind of what evolved into their approach for insecticides, I think was interesting, because they weren't interested in trying to preserve particular trees indefinitely, because they were concerned that it was going to become so many trees that it would outstrip their resources at some point. But they were interested in using insecticides in some way. And so what they came to was a strategy to use insecticides more as a management tool rather than a management tool for emerald ash borer rather than a forest management tool. And so here's an example of a neighborhood in St. Paul, and this is not the initial neighborhood. This is, I think this is maybe the second neighborhood that it turned up in. And when it was found in this neighborhood, I think it was in 2011, you can see on the map we've got a bunch of red dots. So the blue dots were all the ash trees in this area of the neighborhood. The red dots are the ones that were found to be infested. And what the city did is they went and they removed all of those infested trees, but then a lot of the public ash trees right around those trees, they treated with insecticide that next year. So the thinking was that we're going to remove the worst trees, but we assume there are still beetles in that neighborhood. And so if we're replacing a lot of insecticide treated trees in that neighborhood, we get the benefit of we still have the trees. And also we're going to be reducing the emerald ash borer population, which should help the rest of our forest by making the population smaller, slowing population growth, etc. Another thing that we have tried to emphasize to folks is the importance to think about the time of year when doing work for emerald ash borer. So pretty early in the process, right away in 2009, we published these best management practices. And really, there's a bunch of explanation that go with them, but really the key point is that emerald ash borer beetles are active during the summer. And so we want to avoid pruning or removing ash trees in infested areas during the summer, because you can imagine if you have a branch or a tree that gets removed and the beetles haven't all emerged yet, and you take it even 10 miles down the road to a place where it's going to be disposed, you might have moved emerald ash borer 10 miles down the road that it otherwise was going to have to do itself. So one of our key points throughout this has been that do your emerald ash borer removals, your prunings in areas where it's present during the fall, winter, spring, and avoid the summer. And again, the primary reason is that we're concerned that emerald ash borer might be in those prunings or the logs from the tree that might be removed. This was a little confusing for people because folks in the Twin Cities are also very familiar with oak wilt, and oak wilt has some seasonal prohibitions against pruning and removing trees, but it's really the opposite thinking. So with oak wilt, we don't want to prune or remove trees because it provides opportunities for the fungus to invade trees. But in this case, we're not worried about emerald ash borer being more attracted to the pruned or removed trees. It's we're worried that it may be in those pieces. And St. Paul, again, holding them up as an example, had a kind of a neat thing. They would put signs out in these infested neighborhoods to alert the residents, as well as they knew that you don't want to do your removals, your prunings during the summer. So wait till fall. And another thing that came up pretty frequently in the Twin Cities was the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River runs through Minneapolis and St. Paul, and significant stretches of the river are very wild and have a lot of just naturally growing trees along them. So this picture is actually taken, right from the middle of Minneapolis, St. Paul, looking down the river. And so both cities were very concerned about what was going to happen with these trees, many of which are inaccessible because of bluffs. They didn't want to be trying to remove these trees. They wanted to be trying to treat them with insecticides. And we had, some discussion about that. And it became apparent that those things aren't options in natural areas like this. And these are settings where oftentimes trees, there may not be another option than to have them be infested, killed, and eventually fall apart. But we do have the option of the biological control agents. So we've tried to use the river as more of an opportunity. So even though our other tools, sanitation and insecticides, aren't feasible, it's a great place to try and get the parasitoids established and making their own dent in the emerald ash borer population. So we've been working pretty hard, really at all infested sites that have some natural forest component to them to get some of the agents going and get them also working on emerald ash borer. And that's been a recommendation to cities: is don't let the fact that you have natural areas within your city stop you from managing in the landscaped areas. Manage aggressively in those landscaped areas and understand that those natural areas, it's going to be what it's going to be. And yeah, you're probably going to have much higher emerald ash borer pressure near those areas, but there's probably not much you can do about that. Ideally down into the future, the parasitic wasps are going to have a big impact on the emerald ash borer population, and we're optimistic of that. But that will, remain to be seen as things unfold here into the future. And a really key point has been that I think every city, like I mentioned before, every city in Minnesota is looking at this from a forest management perspective. And we also advise cities, along with trying to take some steps to manage the emerald ash borer population, you should also be thinking of it from the angle of managing your forest. And there are great tools out there for cities to do that. To help them plan out very specifically based on what kind of an inventory they have, what their preference is for removal versus treatment, costs, etc. All the tools are there. So, and that's been the case really. If I again use St. Paul as an example, they've been pretty aggressively trying to manage the emerald ash borer, but at the same time, they're also doing work to manage their forests. So they are going into other parts of the city, and they're removing trees, and they're planting trees other than ash, and that's also an important component. So I don't think we want to think about trying to manage the beetle as a solution in and of itself. Really, it's something that might help to slow the process down and buy more time for your forest management strategies. But really, you need to have that component in there as well, I think. Okay, and so that's kind of what our approach has evolved into in terms of how we advise cities in terms of trying to deal with it. And again, they make their own decisions. And I think if we polled every city that's got emerald ash borer in Minnesota, we would get a little bit different response in terms of just exactly what they're doing. And I think that's okay. Everybody's got a little bit different local perspective, and My philosophy has always been the only management that's bad management is no management. So, but now I want to get into a little bit more of our work on trying to identify infested trees, and I'll be able to show you some data here. We've had kind of a variety of projects that we've done with this over the past 6 or so years. And really, one of our first questions with Emerald Ash Borer was that we're looking for infested trees, and we're using woodpecking as an indicator that it's an infested tree. But how much of a difference is there really between these trees that have these external symptoms of emerald ash borer and maybe a tree right next to it that we can't find any of those external symptoms of emerald ash borer? So that was one of the first questions that we asked in terms of thinking about how we would implement a program was, is there really a difference? Are we really picking out trees that are better to remove than any other tree by walking around and looking for woodpecks? And I should mention, you notice the snow on the trees and whatnot. We figured out fairly early in the process that summer was not a great time to be out looking for symptoms like woodpecks and bark cracks on the stems and branches of trees. You just can't see them well enough with the canopies there. So this is work we right away, pretty much from that first year, started doing in the winter. So pretty much all these pictures should be during the winter, I think. Okay, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we looked at that. And so we collected a bunch of data to try and compare these woodpeck and non-woodpeck trees. And these were trees that are on the same block. So when the cities were removing trees, we did this over a few years, we would be taking samples. And so these are trees that we would have already inspected. So we would have some kind of record as to what visual symptoms they had. Could we find any visual symptoms or could we not? And we took samples from both trees that did have visual symptoms and trees that were being removed that did not, again, in the same blocks and neighborhoods here. And we had standard places from which we took samples. So we would take a sample from the upper canopy, one from the mid canopy, and one from the lower canopy from each of these trees. So we'd have 3 logs about 3 to 4 feet in length that we would take from each of these trees. And then we would remove the bark from these samples, and a whole bunch of people helped out with that. And then as the bark was removed, we would count the larvae that were within these samples. So we would have, in the end, a count of the larvae in the woodpeck trees and a count of the larvae in the trees that did not have any woodpecks. Now this gets a little bit complicated in terms of explaining the results. And so just for a moment, we'll look at the EAB life cycle. And as I'm sure everybody knows, emerald ash borer generally has a 1-year life cycle, but it can take 2 years. And particularly during this time frame that we were doing work in Minnesota, we were finding at least half of the population that we were looking at seemed to be on a 2-year life cycle. So when we would remove a tree in the winter, about half of the larvae would be small instar larvae that were unlikely to emerge that next summer and probably would not be emerging until the summer after. And so that becomes important in terms of thinking about what we're seeing in those trees that we're looking at during the winter. So if we think about kind of separating what's in these trees into different cohorts, one that we can come up with right away is beetles that have already been in these trees and have emerged. So if we think about a tree out in the landscape right now that's infested with emerald ash borer, it might have some exit holes in it. So those are beetles that have been there, they've used the tree, they've gone on, and I'm calling that the past cohort. And if we think about it, it doesn't really do us any good to find trees with a bunch of exit holes, because if we remove that tree, it's not removing very many emerald ash borers from the population. They've already exited the tree and gone on to do their thing. However, a tree out on the landscape right now is also likely going to have some large or late instar larvae that are beetles that are going to emerge the subsequent summers. So again, if we think about this winter, these would be beetles that would be emerging as adults in the summer of 2016. And I call that our present cohort. So that would be the most important in terms of sanitation program to get those beetles that would be emerging the next year and remove and destroy them before they can. And then finally, like I was talking about with this 2-year life cycle that some individuals have, if we look at a tree right now in Minnesota and we pull out the larvae, we're gonna find some that are small instars, early instars, and they're very unlikely to complete their development and emerge next summer, summer of 2016, and it would be more likely they would be emerging in the summer of 2017. And this is important in looking at our results because we saw a difference among these three cohorts and what we're finding in these trees. And so here are our cohorts down on the x-axis. And so this is the past cohort. These are exit holes that we're finding. This is the present cohort. So these are late instar larvae will emerge the next summer. And these are our small early instar larvae that would not be emerging until the summer after next. So they're on the 2-year life cycle, or they're in the first year of the 2-year life cycle at least. And so what we did is we compared how many larvae there were per square meter in each of these cohorts in trees without woodpecking and trees with woodpecking. And what we saw is that we saw a difference in exit holes. So woodpecks were great at identifying trees that had more exit holes. Again, that doesn't do us much good. More importantly, the visual evaluation was also helpful to pick out trees that had more of the current generation of beetles that were going to be emerging the next summer. So that is important from a sanitation standpoint, that we have a cue that's going to help us pick out trees that are going to remove more beetles from the population if we prioritize removing those trees. And then not so good for finding those smaller instar larvae. So trees that have perhaps mostly smaller instar larvae, perhaps they haven't been infested as long, perhaps woodpeckers have not discovered them yet. We didn't see any difference between trees that had symptoms and trees that did not have symptoms. So not a great indicator for those trees, but again, from a sanitation standpoint, it did do well at indicating our most important trees. And so this is a kind of a cartoon in a table format that I use to illustrate to people my imagining of how this works. And so if we think about what's happening within a tree in terms of EAB, what symptoms we're seeing and how many years it's been infested, again, this is just a very general idea kind of a thing. When a tree first becomes infested, probably there are just small larvae present in that first year or two, and you may not have woodpeckers finding those trees. You probably won't have any bark splits. There probably are no visual symptoms. But as you go along through time, you are more and more likely to find symptoms if you're looking closely, until you get to a point where there are so many larvae in that tree that the canopy is impacted and eventually it will die. So a key thing that I've been trying to communicate to people about this is that if you're looking closely, most of the time you should be able to find symptoms like this before you get into the canopy impacts and dead and dying trees. Not always. There have been exceptions where we have trees that are very heavily infested with emerald ash borer, do not have any woodpecking, we can't find any bark splits, so it's not a 100% rule. But I would say in general, these symptoms are going to appear first. And it's something to be, how do you watch for it? Well, you watch for these things. And again, we like to do that during the winter. Okay, so we've also done some work in trying to compare different ways to do survey, because there's some options beyond just going out and looking at trees. But that has been one thing that we've always kept in the mix, just because that's kind of how we got started, is by trying to visually identify these trees. We have also worked in a comparison with the traps. And finally, we've been looking at the branch sampling as well. So 3 different methods that a city or some other entity might use to monitor for emerald ash borer, help to inform their management efforts. And what we've been trying to do is compare the utility of these different methods and how a city might implement them. And so we've had a study. This is funded by the Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund, state of Minnesota. And we have a number of study sites that we've set up throughout the state. And you can think about this, wrong way. Down in the south, we've had a longer infestation, a more rural area, less management, and we've got lots of emerald ash borer at sites down in the southeast. In the Twin Cities, we have, I would say, moderate to low EAB, get more into the moderate, a little bit higher at this point, but definitely lower than the southeast. And then up here in Duluth, which is across from Superior, Wisconsin, where emerald ash borer is known to be present, but we've not yet been able to find any emerald ash borer in Duluth. As far as we know, we still don't have any EAB. So we had kind of a gradient of EAB pressure across these sites, and we're looking at our detection tools across these different sites to see how they perform. And I'm going to just pick out one of these sites in the interest of time, and I'm picking out kind of the ideal one, so I'll just admit that at the beginning. But this is in Shoreview, which is a suburb of St. Paul, Minneapolis. And You can see that we've got some infested trees over here in Shoreview. These were found, I believe it was in 2011, might have been 2012. But we set up a study site over here to the east in a part of the neighborhood where emerald ash borer hadn't been found yet. So we had EAB found nearby, but not yet in this neighborhood. And then what we did in this neighborhood is we went through and we looked at all of the ash trees during the summer and rated their canopy with the idea that the standard recommendation is if you have more than 40 to 50% canopy loss, your trees are beyond treating for EAB. So we rated them on this scale of how much canopy loss there was. And trees were pretty good in this neighborhood at that point in time. And if we put that on a histogram, you can see that the vast majority of our trees fell into these categories of 1 and 2, which is less than 40% canopy loss, and would be trees that would be possible for insecticide treatment if the city or property owners so chose. So it was actually about 97% of the trees in that neighborhood, and just 3% were of a state that they were not treatable. And that wasn't necessary from emerald ash borer. They just were not in good condition. And we can compare that to one of our sites in the southeast where we're working. So this is a study site we set up at Great River Bluffs State Park, and very high emerald ash borer populations there. You can see all the red and orange. A lot of the trees were in tough shape at the point we were setting up the study. And if we put them on that same histogram, the vast majority of the trees are beyond the point of doing anything to treat them if someone was interested in doing that. So I guess my point in showing you these two sites would be that first site, the Shoreview site, would be a good candidate for doing some survey and detection to inform management efforts, because you have opportunities to do management at that site. Whereas the site down at the state park, not so much. There's not really any point in doing survey where emerald ash borer is widely abundant and has already had a major impact on the trees. Okay, if we go back to Shoreview, I'll show you how we implemented the actual study. So we chose some study trees throughout this site, and these are not chosen randomly, but rather were meant to be as grid-like as we could put them. When this study is all done, we're in the last year, there'll be a spatial analysis that's done in the data. So we're trying to space out our study trees to facilitate that analysis. So that's how those were chosen. And we put traps up in the trees. I know this site, we did not have any positive traps in this year, though other ones we did. So you're going to see the traps will just remain purple, but they did catch beetles in other sites and other situations. So, okay, after we put the traps up, and they were up during the summer, then we went back during the winter, and we did a visual evaluation of each of these trees. And the way we did this is we used 3 people, and each person independently looked at each tree, and they looked for woodpecking, they looked for bark splits, they looked for tunneling. And if we had 2 of the 3 people find those things on the trees, we considered it to be an infested tree. So that's whether they found woodpecking, whether they found tunneling. And we're using the premise that for cities, a suspect tree is enough for them to take action. They don't necessarily need to see the tunneling. So woodpecking was enough if we had 2 of the 3 people note that it was woodpecked. Okay, and so when we did that in Shoreview, we had 1 tree that came up as positive from that visual assessment. And then we went back and we took 2 branches from each of these trees and we sampled them for emerald ash borer. And in this neighborhood, we found the same tree infested with emerald ash borer. So none of the other ones could we find any larvae, but in that tree, we did find EAB. And then what we have typically done with cities is we've been working with them, and at this point, there are enough of them, they're kind of on their own, but we really encourage them to do a late winter survey for infested trees. And so that was done after the branch sampling, and we found a few more infested trees, some of them on private property, and they're kind of clustered around that initial find. So it was, in my mind, an indicator that the EAB survey efforts can be beneficial because as far as we can tell in this neighborhood, with some pretty rigorous sampling, there's not a lot of emerald ash borer present, and they're kind of concentrated. So if you concentrated your management efforts as well, you might get more of a bang for your buck than if you're just kind of spreading them randomly throughout the neighborhood, with some other criteria. In contrast, here's a site in St. Paul. And so here was a site that had a little bit more EAB activity, and we found all kinds of stuff through our sampling. And I guess the value in doing survey in this area, it would tell you you had a substantial problem and that you probably wanted to do some work that was a little bit more widespread through the neighborhood rather than concentrated to one little pocket. So even though we found lots and lots in this survey, it still may have been informative to management efforts to understand how to manage in this neighborhood. And one thing that has been interesting, it'll take me a minute to explain this graph, and I've got just a few more graphs, and we'll be at the end of the slideshow. But one thing that's been interesting to me is the difference between the visual evaluation and the branch sampling, because as we would expect, the branch sampling is going to be much more sensitive, and we're going to be able to find trees that are infested but don't show any visual symptoms. So in terms of an ideal tool, that would be it. However, the issue is also that it takes a fair amount more time and labor to do branch sampling than it does to just walk down the street and visually inspect the trees as you go along. So what I'm comparing in this graph is a comparison between trees that we identified as visually infested and infested through peeling, trees that we identified as infested through peeling but not visually, and then I've got just a note about a few trees that we picked up visually but not through peeling. So to explain this graph, this is a histogram, and we're looking at EAB density across the x-axis. So as we go across, we've got trees that are progressively more infested, and the y-axis is frequency. So this is the number of trees that fell into each of these categories for EAB abundance for both trees where our results agreed, the visual and the peeling, and trees where they disagreed. And so what you can see is the vast majority of our trees, we got the same result from the visual evaluation as we did from peeling. We did have a number of trees where we did not find EAB visually, but we did find it from peeling. However, most of them were very low densities of EAB, so less than 10 galleries per square meter. So that is encouraging in that the trees that were missing, or that we missed in this instance through visual inspection, did not have a whole lot of EAB in them relative to what was found at the peeling. Interestingly, we did have 8 trees that 2 out of 3 people identified visually as having symptoms, but we did not find anything when we sampled 2 branches from those trees. We have now the advantage of another year of sampling. This is the winter of 2014. So in the winter of 2014-2015, actually 5 of these trees we did find positive through the peeling. So this was an instance where, in this case, we had symptoms that we found visually, but not through peeling. So when the tree got pruned, it just didn't quite get the right branches to sample. So that was 2013-2014. I can show you the same, exact same graph for the winter of 2014-2015. So this is laid out exactly the same way with progressively more emerald ash borer in these trees. Again, we're looking at results where the sampling methods agreed and where they did not, and we had a little bit more favorable in favor of them agreeing with each other in terms of the results. So the visual evaluation, again, not as sensitive as the peeling, but held up fairly well. And we do have, again, this year we've got these 6 trees where we had a visual positive and did not find anything peeling. And we'll see in this last year of the study, which we're just working on now, if some more of those turn up as positive. So the other thing that to me that's interesting, along with kind of a assessment of how well those tools held up, and I didn't try to put the traps into this because it's a little bit harder to try and incorporate into this type of representation. So the traps did catch beetles in most of our sites. I think they are a viable survey tool just for our purposes of trying to identify individual infested trees, not as practical as looking specifically at the trees with the visual method or the peeling. And then just to bring things together, like I said, intuitively you would expect that it's going to take less time and effort to visually look at a tree than to sample branches from it. And so we've been keeping track of our time as we're doing these different things. And what we found is that it takes about 20% of the time for visual evaluation as it has for us to do the branch sampling. And both of those numbers are a little bit awkward because for the visual evaluation, I'm just counting the time for all 3 of our people. So really it would be about 1/3 of what we're recording. However, the same could be said for the branch sampling, because in addition to finding emerald ash borer in a sample, we also want to know how dense it is in that sample. So we're not stopping as soon as we find 1 gallery in a branch, we're sampling the entire branch. So both of those numbers are a little bit inflated. In my mind, they're probably inflated about the same degree. So I think the ratio is probably fairly relevant in terms of about 1/5 of the effort, visual versus feeling. And again, we know feeling is going to be more sensitive. It's just a question of how much sensitivity will you need for what your management goals might be. And I think that really is what it all comes down to. And in terms of our trying to advise cities, is that you really need a clear understanding of what your goals are. And if you come up with that, there are the tools available to reach those goals. You just it's a little bit of, you have some flexibility in terms of how you implement them, and we've got some options. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. And if there are some questions, I would be happy to answer them at this point.
Mark, I appreciate this webinar. It's great to hear from what others have experienced, and so many of us can learn from all the work that you've done, and you've done a lot of work. Cliff Sadoff does have a question here. It says, you mentioned dealing with EAB infested trees by removing or treating. Can't you just assume the trees in an area are all infested so you can get the trees treated before substantial death occurs?
Yeah, I think you could. And I think that's where you get into, what is the goal of the city. So if they're looking at, they want to preserve most of the trees in the neighborhood, and say, yeah, you want to look at treating a substantial number of them. I think what my point would be that depending on where you are in terms of the infestation in a neighborhood, you might be able to elucidate that a bit with doing some survey, and it might help you to target where you're using that insecticide. You might be able to perhaps treat fewer trees in the neighborhood than you otherwise would have had to.
Okay. Are there other questions? You can type them into the Q&A section here that is provided. I did want to say too, there has been a question about the CEUs for this presentation. I wanted to let you know that you can if you look in the chat feature of the webinar, Amy Stone has given her email address, which is stone.91@osu.edu. And if you could send her an email and with your information, she'll be able to send you a certificate. So, oh, Cliff has another question. How have you been getting community buy-in to support your efforts?
Well, to be honest, it's been a little bit all over the board in terms of how people are approaching EAB. So I think that we've gotten pretty good buy-in in terms of the importance of taking action. It seems, as everybody has the same issue, resources are always the limiting factor. So in terms of actually implementing actions, it's really been it's been all over the board. Some cities have been able to garner more resources and been very aggressive. St. Paul and Minneapolis are great examples of two very different approaches. St. Paul, like I described, has taken kind of an approach looking both at the EAB management as well as the forest management. Minneapolis has evolved into more of just a forest management perspective. But I think that buy-in is good. If we had the resources to buy more stuff, that's the limiting factor at this point.
All right, Linda says, Birchwood, Minnesota is a small community that is heavily wooded. Would you recommend doing a late winter inspection of ash? If so, is there a minimum diameter ash tree trunk that woodpecks would likely be seen in?
Well, I think if you have the resources to do it, it's always a good idea to be doing whatever surveillance you can for emerald ash borer. And probably your best option at this point would be just a visual evaluation. Couldn't hurt to sample a few trees too if you could. And then the diameter, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a minimum diameter. There probably is, but I haven't necessarily seen that in practice. And the thing of it is that the smaller diameter trees are so fast and easy to evaluate that there's really no harm in taking a look at them. And oftentimes what we'll see on those smaller diameter trees is more likely to see some splitting bark rather than woodpecking. But again, they're very, if we're talking about trees less than 6 inches in diameter, very easy to quickly evaluate.
Okay. I have a question for you. What do you see do you have an idea of maybe some future types of efforts that you will be trying in the Minneapolis St. Paul area or in the state of Minnesota that you see after going through what you've gone through as far as with Emerald Ash Borer?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us at this point is that we need to do a better job of trying to disseminate what we've learned out to cities. I think certainly, the folks that are dealing with Emerald Ash Borer have heard it from us, but there's a lot of communities, and we're trying to come up with some resources to better get that information out to people and better give them some guidance in terms of how they might incorporate some of these things. And there's always, certainly folks that are interested in trying to come up with some more resources for communities. And I think that is without the resources to do stuff, we're not going to get communities to do anything. So I think that is also an ongoing effort that, eventually may bear some fruit, but is still in progress.
Okay. Thias Reef would like to know, do you have any sense of the effectiveness of using wasps as a strategy? And if so, how are you evaluating their success?
Yeah, that's something we've also been working pretty hard on sampling. And so we've had, kind of the first step is that we've been able to recover wasps at least a few of our sites where they've been released. So that's a good indicator. Both the Tetrasticus, I always have trouble with that one, and the Ovius, we've been able to recover both of those at release sites years after they've been released. And so now we're also, while we're doing other things, we're monitoring the EAB population, the rates of parasitism in those populations. So we don't have answers to that yet, and there may be folks that are a little bit farther ahead of us in other states with that, but we are closely watching that. And again, we're optimistic that that will eventually be another thing that's taking a bite out of the EAB population.
Okay. Dave has asked, have there been any more EAB finds in Rochester, Minnesota since initial finds last year?
Yeah, there continue to be trees in that same neighborhood that have been found as infested, but not different parts of the city yet. So Rochester's been very active. They've got a great forestry department. They're actively looking for EAB. They've got a management plan, so they're in a good position. And of course, we expect that over time, other parts of the city it will be found in other parts of the city, but it hasn't been yet.
All right. Stephen Booth asks, in southeastern Pennsylvania, EAB has recently arrived. Any advice for advocating treatment rather than simply removal, which a number of small municipalities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania have opted for, rather than spending money for treatments?
Yeah, well, I think that's also an ongoing communication thing. And certainly, people always want to be left with the option of removal or treatment because, locally, some people may have strong feelings one way or the other, and they need to make their own decisions. However, I do think that, from my experience too, there is often a knee-jerk reaction that removal is the only option, and we know it's not. So I do think there's a continuing need to communicate to people that you have options. You can, it is what you make of it, and we've got the tools. You have to choose how to implement them, but don't assume that you can't treat trees, because you certainly can.
Thank you. Linda says, can a homeowner or property manager wait until woodpecks are found to begin insecticide treatment of ash?
Well, that's kind of the $1,000,000 question is, when do you start? And what I always tell people is that it's dependent on how much risk you're willing to tolerate. I don't really like the radius, so many miles and start treating. Because if you are watching your trees closely, you're keeping an eye on what's going on in your neighborhood, you probably can afford to wait longer than someone who's not. So I think, really that's how I explain it to people, is if you have a tree that you can't bear the thought of losing, then I would be thinking about pulling the trigger sooner than rather than later. But also factors to consider is how confident are you in your ability to keep track of the tree's condition, and how are you keeping tabs on trees, the condition of trees elsewhere in your neighborhood or area, because that might give you an early indicator of something going on.
All right, thank you. Do you have a guess as to why approximately 50% of the EAB population in the Twin Cities took 2 years to develop? Was it the climate, tree health, something else?
Well, I know Michigan State had talked about it, early on in the process, that it was kind of a function of population density there, and so as populations got bigger and denser, they saw more individuals doing the 1 year versus 2 year generation. And we might see that same thing here. We haven't tried to look at our data over, the 6 or 7 years we've been working with this to see if we're seeing a difference in terms of proportion. I think we should do that at some point, because it would be interesting to see. The Twin Cities are, Emerald ash borer is thriving here, but it is also one of the colder areas where it occurs. So we do see some significant winter mortality from time to time. A couple of years ago in the famous polar vortex, we had very significant larval mortality. So I guess I bring that up to say that climate also could play a role in there in terms of shorter development time. Again, I don't really have an answer other than I think it's something that could be looked at.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions. If you have other questions, I hope you can type those in quickly here. We're approaching the 1 hour mark. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this, because your experience is going to help a lot of folks that are either just starting to deal with this or have questions on how to deal with it and where they should go from there. I did want to tell folks there on the emeraldashborer.info website, there's a lot of the work that a lot of these municipalities and states have worked on, in case you're looking for other examples of what's been going on and how people are trying to manage this pest. Because, as Mark has said, there's many options. There's more than one way to deal with this, and looking at all your options may be helpful in finding a way that best suits your area. I'm not seeing any other questions. I want to thank you again, Mark. This has been really great information. I appreciate all the participants for coming on and listening, and I hope you've learned a lot. I'm going to end the webinar here in just about a minute. So thanks again. I'm going to give you some time to if any more questions and answers. But again, appreciate everyone's time, and Mark, especially you, for all this work you've done to put this together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. My pleasure.
All right, Linda is asking, do you see state or community funding assistance for homeowners in Minnesota coming down the pike?
I've not been hearing anyone talk about funding for private property owners. What's come up has been what's been available, and what I've heard talked about in the future has been for communities, but I haven't heard of anything for private property owners.
And I'll agree with that. I have that question come to me often from the website, and I go out and ask folks, and we're not seeing that either. Okay, the question is it too late in the season for soil injections, and would that have any effect on EAB already present?
Well, I should probably defer to someone else for the timing of the insecticides. My understanding is you can still apply to the soil in the fall, and what you would be doing then is the insecticide would be having an impact on next year's population of beetles. So I don't know that you would have an impact on anything in the tree currently, but again, I would defer that. You should ask someone else that question probably. I can throw something out there. Usually at this point in the year, there's not a lot of, the tree isn't doing a lot of uptake, so that may not be a good time to do this. But again,
I know that Dr. Cliff Sadoff was on the webinar. I don't know if he wants to weigh in on that or not. And a lot of the products for soil, at least for homeowners for doing soil drenches, they will give you a timeline on when that would be, when that would work, and when the best time is. So we'll see if maybe Dr. Sadoff wants to say something. All right, I'm not seeing an answer. So I'm going to close the meeting. And again, I appreciate everyone for your participation. And you may find answers to your questions again for some of those things on the emeralddashboard.info website. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mark.
Yep. See ya.